Hello and welcome to podcast.init. We are recording today on April 8th, and we have Chris, Patti, and myself, Tobias Macey, as your hosts. Today we're interviewing Thomas Hatch, the creator of SaltStack.
So I just wanted to say a quick word about, I just came back from Chefconf in Santa Clara, California last week, and I know this is a Python podcast, and moreover, we're talking to the man behind SaltStack, so Chef might be just a little bit out of topic, but I just had to say, on the Python front, it's amazing to see how much the polyglot programming way of life has taken. There was a lot of Python talk in the hallway track there, and some of it may spawn some interviews that we may have in upcoming episodes, and I'm really looking forward to. It's neat to see people becoming more open-minded about tools, and when you get smart people using interesting things, it's only coolness can result. So that was great. I had a great time. I highly recommend it. Also, on the community front, but back more towards Python, I just want to mention that there's another podcast out there. It came out right around the same time as, we kind of looked around and said, hey, there are no Python podcasts out there. We should make one. And it's called Talk Python to Me. It's at www.talkpythontome.com, and we'll have the full URL in the show notes. It's a great show, and I just listened to episode 1 last night and this morning. He talked about and had an interview with the man behind Eve, a really cool REST API web service module for Python that just lets you take MongoDB or other database schema and make it into a RESTful API very easily. I look forward to playing with it myself, and we're just happy to have someone else in the game here. I think more is better in this undertaking, and so please go give him a listen. You won't regret it.
All right, and with that, I would like to introduce our guest, Thomas Hatch. Thank you for joining us, and would you please introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your background to our audience, to anyone who may not have heard of you yet?
Sure, and thanks for having me. My name's Thomas Hatch, and I'm the original author and founder of the SaltStack company and author of Salt. Yeah, I started working on Salt back in February of 2011, and I started doing it full-time beginning of 2012. Yeah, before that I did systems administration and the system software development, so yeah, I've deployed many a cloud in my day.
So how did you get introduced to Python?
Oh, I honestly, I don't really remember. I mean, I go back to studying computer science in school where I was taught Java, and I haven't used Java since then. And back in school, there were a lot of people excited about Python, a lot of people excited about Ruby. And I was very interested in learning languages, and so I spent time with some esoterics. Even went through and learned OCaml. Spent a lot of time with Ruby. Spent a lot of time in C and etc. And after working with Python, I just found it a lot more natural of a language to work with, and just enjoyed working with Python more. So from an origin perspective, it's more of my primary argument was generally just preference.
It's really interesting how often OCaml crops up. It's one of those languages that even though it's not listed among mainstream programming languages per se, the thread of its use wends its way through all kinds of different people and places, and it seems like a really neat language. I have yet to actually take the time to learn it, but seems like there's got to be something there for so many people to have used it and cited it as an influence.
I definitely think of OCaml as an influencer, and I'd strongly recommend people to learn it, not necessarily to use it, but more so to understand the flexibility of the functional paradigm, and to understand how that how they put object-oriented programming directly inside of a functional paradigm. It's a really fascinating language.
So what made you choose Python for writing salt stack in? Was it just a matter of preference, or were there particular architectural capacities that it had that made you want to choose it? And if you were to start from scratch all over again, would you use Python again, or would you choose a different language?
OCaml's already been brought up, so I can't crack a joke and say, "Oh, I would use OCaml." No, I would definitely use Python again, and I think that the choice of using Python was a good one. And I look back, and there's a lot of things that we've been able to do in Salt because we chose Python. One of the main tenets of Salt is its plugin system. And that plugin system is something that was very easy to write, very easy to make powerful in using Python. And because of the way that you can introspect the language, the way that you can really bend it to your will, and the very dynamic nature of being able to load things on the fly in a reasonable way. And so, I mean, that's been a big boon. And then some of the other aspects of Python that have been really beneficial has been a lot of the concurrency libraries and systems which have more recently come into play. And that's one of those exciting things where we've been able to begin implementing more and more of that concurrency aspect inside of Salt to make it even faster and even more efficient.
Say that having the plugin capabilities has made my life easier on a few occasions, being able to write your own little module that does exactly what you want and plug it into the overall execution paradigm without having to dig deep into any of the internals definitely makes for a really architecturally sound capability.
Thank you. Yep, that was definitely a goal, to make those plugins as easy as possible.
What are some of the challenges you faced maintaining a large and complex Python code base like SaltStack? Does Python make anything easier or harder?
That's there's definitely pitfalls in Python with large code bases, and there's a lot that we've done architecturally to try and keep that so that it's less of a complex problem. So one of the main things that we've done to alleviate just having an overly complex code base in general is Salt's loader and plugin system. And so Salt itself, the Salt code base is somewhere in the realm of 90% plugins. And by somewhere in the realm, I haven't actually done the math, I haven't done the calculation on it recently. And Salt has 21 plugin systems right now. And the fact that we can have these completely isolated plugin subsystems inside of Salt and having the code isolation has been one of the biggest benefits for being able to manage such a large code base, because functionally the entire capability of every individual component is reasonably isolated into its own scope, which makes it really easy to be able to do things like completely rewrite how, say, we manage a certain container type. I mean, we just completely overhauled all of our LXC container systems, and it only meant effectively editing a couple of files. And so that's been a huge benefit.
That's great. So something that just occurred to me, sort of, first of all, I'm curious, when you say separate plugin systems, I have a funny feeling that there's some meaning behind those words that for those of us who are less Salt savvy, could you explain what you meant by that as opposed to just straight plugins?
Yeah. So a lot of people look at Salt and they see Salt as a configuration management system. I mean, we generally get lumped in that category. I mean, not generally, almost always. And the reality is that Salt is more of a generic management system. And so we have many, many different layers of Salt which are pluggable. And so when we look at it, you were mentioning before how easy it is to write some functions and plop it in. And so what most people see as the primary plugin system is the execution modules. And that's just running a single Salt command, and it goes out and fires off that chunk of Python code. But then the config management system is all in a different plugin layer called states, and those states call down to those execution modules, so those two plugin systems work together. And so that's how we get config management, is that we take, we've got command and control, really simple remote execution, and then we're able to put and layer a new system on top of it, which is configuration management. But then, like the file server backend system in Salt is a plugin system. And that's the component that allows the Salt master to directly hook into a Git repository, so that as soon as you commit your config management components or your own plugins into Git, they're instantly available to Salt. And so since that's a plugin system, we've got a plugin for Git, a plugin for Mercurial, SVN, or Azure FS and Amazon's S3, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, we've got plugins, a plugin system for authentication. We just introduced the new beacon system, which is really cool because Salt is an entirely event-based system. And so the beacons allows you to watch any arbitrary thing that's going on in your environment and then fire events. So that you can fire an event when specific files are changed, deleted, or created. You can fire events when someone logs in. And then that goes up into the reactor system, which is another plugin system. And so really, Salt is really this combination of all of these plugin systems, and realizing that you can build virtually any application that you want to distributed across an infrastructure using Salt. Sorry, that probably just made your question, and please clarify this into, that's confusing and there's lots of bits I didn't know about.
Actually, no, I think you did an excellent job, because as I kind of hinted at with my Chefconf reference earlier, I work with Chef day in, day out in my day job, and it struck me as you were explaining it that this must make adding not just new wrinkles, but whole new concepts easier than a more declarative DSL sort of system, because everything is much more abstract and modular at its base. Is that right?
Very, very much so. Yeah, because the goal is a lot more than setting up and maintaining systems. The goal is keeping track of those systems and managing them in a very holistic way.
Yeah, I have to say that beacon system definitely sounds very intriguing, and I can't wait to have an opportunity to try that out, because I've played a little bit with the reactor system, particularly for managing doing code deployments from GitHub webhooks, but the beacon system sounds like it's just add a lot more capability and adaptability to your system. You know, like, as you mentioned, being able to fire an event when a file gets changed. Like, there's just no end to the number of different ideas or concepts you could do with that.
Yeah, I should say that the excitement around beacons, we announced them at SaltConf, which was just 1 month ago, and the excitement was overwhelming. I mean, that was the only thing everybody was talking about. It seemed like for all of SaltConf, that they were saying, "Oh, I can create all sorts of dynamic reactions now based on anything that happens," I mean, we've got companies. We just added a beacon that every time, so if somebody logs into a minion, every command that they execute on the shell gets fired as an event, so that then they can have an event filter that just shows them and tracks every command executed on every system by that user, so that they get this centralized log of all activity that's happened in their infrastructure. And so, I mean, just all sorts of things like that people have been really excited about.
It's amazing. I bet that would make PCI or SOX compliance a lot simpler to manage, having the audit trail of everybody who's ever been in any of the systems.
Yeah, and that's one of the big motivations, and we've had a bunch of customers come back and ask us for it, which is why, again, we're excited to put it in.
Great. And that follows into our next question of how do you balance the desires and needs of the open source community around SaltStack with the desires and needs of the company behind it? Do those two communities ever come in conflict, or has it generally been a synergistic effect so far?
What you're asking is an incredibly tricky balance, and a very tricky balance from both ends. And my goal with SaltStack has been to create a company that fuels the community and is fueled by the community. I talk about this a little bit more in my keynote for Chefconf that we should have up on the web here in the next few days. But the main goal is that we as a company are able to gain insight and learn from our community and learn how to continue to develop products to serve the needs of others just in general. And we've done a very good job, I believe, of keeping that synergistic. And we've done that by making sure that we're not open core. The plugin system helps a great deal because we are able to there's certainly situations where we have proprietary plugins that we only ship to enterprise customers, but they're plugins, and they're plugins that only really make sense to people who are already buying the large system that we're plugging into. And the concepts and ideas and innovation that comes out of the community becomes the fire hose for us developing new features and finding out what our customers really want and what our customers that aren't our customers yet really want. And in a very huge way, that synergy has been what drives the business, instead of more of those classical open source business models of going open core or trying to rein in what's happening in the community, because the community can be such a wild, wild west. I mean, we will process sometimes over 200 pull requests in a week. We process more inbound code than anybody else in the configuration management communities easily. And yeah, it's an incredibly active and scary thing to keep on top of. But it all fuels the company, and the company's interests fuel the community. So for instance, going back to beacons were developed to deliver specific utilities that customers were asking for, and we were able to build plugins that are beacons for those customers that are specific to their use cases. But we were able to then take what that customer wanted and put that fundamental system in the open, which then drives us to create more things.
That's awesome. And just to speak really briefly on that note, from the chef community side, I think everybody in this space is struggling with this a little bit. And on the chef side, I know that they one of the things they've been doing recently is starting up an RFC process to sort of try to structure some of that community input, because the chef community has experienced exponential growth, which, as we all know, can be both a good thing and a bad thing. It's so thank you for filling us in.
Yeah, I'll definitely agree that the open core model can be very contentious a lot of times. It can be beneficial to the project and the company because it does provide a way to pay the developers who are working on it and drive it forward. But when it can be avoided, it's definitely preferable, because I've definitely bumped up against some circumstances where there was some functionality that was in the proprietary portion of the code base that wasn't quite compelling enough to make me want to actually jump for the enterprise offering, but just frustrating enough that it turned me away from wanting to use the open source portion of the project. So definitely kudos to you guys for being able to avoid the open core model and still be so wildly successful as you are.
I appreciate it, and it is tricky. The one of the big things that we've discovered is that when we go into a big organization to sell, and some of the benefits of Salt is that it scales well, it works really well in very complex environments, and those companies are more apt to spend money on things like SaltStack. But then the flip side is that much of who we sell to are the groups peripheral to the people who are contributing us code. So we go into a company and we're able to say to the people who are giving us code, who are the people around you who would benefit by visibility into Salt? And then we can sell those people proprietary software that gives them the visibility into what's going on. And those sorts of approaches have been very, very lucrative for us. It's been a very interesting approach to be able to say that instead of trying to bleed money, to get blood out of a turnip by trying to bleed money out of your community, we're able to go out and ask the community, who is it that's around you who wants to give us money, and we'll go ask them.
Yeah, that's a great model, and definitely sounds like a very intelligent way to do business, with making friends everywhere you go and avoiding making any enemies. So, excellent.
So far, so good. We'll see if we're still in business in a few years.
Yep.
I don't see you guys going away anytime soon. I mean, I hear a lot about salt, and I think you guys are experiencing, maybe not quite meteoric adoption, but certainly I think you're in good shape. So if you'll indulge me or allow me to indulge in generalities, developers tend to gravitate towards Chef, sysadmins and ops folks tend to gravitate towards Puppet. Who might find SaltStack a superior choice and why?
So, traditionally, sysadmins have been more intrigued by SaltStack. And a lot of the reasons for that is because Salt does a really good job of solving system administrator problems. Salt does a really good job of solving problems that the developer crowd doesn't necessarily see right off the bat. One thing that's very common that we see is that we will see infrastructures that were built by developers, and that we see a very large adoption once those infrastructures get too big to be maintained by the original developers who built them. And so a lot of it has to do with scale. A lot of it has to do with the fact that because Salt just scales up really, really nicely and doesn't need modification outside of tweaking some configuration parameters to be able to handle a lot of scale and to handle really complex infrastructure problems. With that said, we definitely still see a fair amount of developer adoption. And there's a lot that we've been doing recently and a lot that we're working on right now to try and increase that developer adoption. Because most of our documentation right now is very focused towards system administrators. It's very encyclopedic in nature. And so we're getting very close. We've got a whole new introductory documentation system that was developed by someone other than me, because I'm not good at developing that kind of documentation apparently, that we're going to be introducing very soon. We put a huge amount of effort into Salt SSH to make that whole deployment of code and really seamless, masterless management really, really slick. And we're very, very proud of Salt SSH. It is incredibly fast and gives you virtually all of the functionality of remote execution and config management inside of Salt. I mean, if with this next release that we're finalizing right now, we're on our second RC. The Salt SSH is to the point where it can do everything that Salt can do without having an agent out there. And so these systems we're very, very excited about as we go after that developer market more.
So the Salt SSH aspect sounds really neat. Is that perhaps an answer, without mentioning names, to some other configuration management systems that are gaining ground because of super easy adoption? Like because people can start out with just simple orchestration and add very simple configuration in. I'm thinking of the thing that could be used in a blacksmith shop.
We've learned a lot from our competitors, and definitely watch what they are doing. And I should say that I am very grateful to them from what we've been able to learn. And so yes, there is definitely some answer there. And Salt SSH historically it's a really interesting thing, because originally we wrote it to abstract the transport system out and just kind of clean up the code, and very much so as a challenge to see, hey, could we actually do this? And then we kind of stepped away from it for maybe 6 months or so and said, hey, we accomplished this. We've got a lot of other big things to deal with to handle our big infrastructure customers and our big infrastructure users. And We more recently came back because we saw more and more demand around wanting salt SSH. And so most of our recent work has definitely been an answer to our competitors. And we really look at that and hope that getting out better introductory documentation, helping people understand that from a high level, we still definitely believe that salt is the easiest to use configuration management system out there, and that unlike a lot of other systems out there, we started by solving the hard problems at scale, and that we want to be able to deliver something that is easy to get started with, easy to roll out, all those things that you're saying, but that will grow with the person who's deploying it. Because we've seen so commonly these infrastructures get up to a few hundred servers, and then they come over and they say, well, we need to scale now, and these systems are so slow, and what's taking us hours to do takes us minutes and seconds to do with salt.
That's awesome, and I think the marketplace has spoken very clearly that a really easy ramp up and adoption curve is super important, and that in a way it's kind of less important that the best configuration management system win, but that the easiest win, at least as far as the market is concerned. So I know Chef's been doing a lot in that sphere as well. I'm really glad to hear you folks are recognizing the importance of that and tooling appropriately.
Yeah, and we've really got to get out and market more of what Salt SSH can do now.
All right. So one thing that Salt has that's both a benefit and sometimes potentially a detriment is the fact that it doesn't really impose any particular rigid structure on how you make use of it. So I'm just wondering what some of the complications you've seen arise out of that, of not having a particular prescribed approach to using it, and also some of the major benefits that you've seen as a result of that as well.
So one of the things that I think is interesting about Salt is that I tried to make it so that the config management system would be easy to learn, easy to transfer from person to person, tried to make it so that the systems are really easy to interface with. But as Salt has grown, exactly what you're saying is what's happened is that Salt itself is fundamentally built to be flexible enough to solve any problem that you can throw at it. And the problem that we run into is that can be very overwhelming for people. That we basically say, hey, have a ton of rope. You can build whatever you want to build. And I mean, the benefit to that is very, very straightforward. When we look at some of the things that people have built, I mean, Salt is being used literally to manage cruise ships. I mean, we talk about like Internet of Things. Salt is used to manage cruise ships. It's used to manage slot machines. It's used to manage and deploy code on weather stations in South Africa. And that loose coupling is what enables that level of integration. And that loose coupling is what enables us to, do whatever needs to be done. And and it horrifies people when they come to me and they say, well, Tom, what's the right way to use Salt? And I say, the right way to use Salt is to use it in a way that solves your problems. It's a very different paradigm, because a lot of people want to be handed something that says, here's your rule book so that you don't get into trouble. And we've worked really hard to structure Salt so that it's harder to get into trouble. But it does lend a bit of a challenge when it comes especially to the configuration management end of Salt, that people want that structure in place. And as such, we have developed best practices guides around how to build the configuration management in a way that is more maintainable and is more transferable, and putting a lot of that emphasis on, making really generic Salt states and using Pillar to steer what's happening, which is really the core idea of Pillar. But it definitely has been a challenge. And people are more apt to use a tool out of the box, I will say, that gives you those rigid guidelines. But I feel confident that we will continue to grow. And like you were saying, we've never grown at a meteoric pace. We've grown at a steady and a strong pace. And I think that has to do with the fact that the salt is something which can adapt itself to any scenario. And we're not out there drumming up the hype. We're not out there saying, ooh, look at the shiny bits. We're out there saying, we will solve your real problems and help, and make those problems go away in a real way, instead of, trying to sell the snake oil of the moment.
That's excellent. And I'm glad that you folks are putting some focus into giving people some guidelines, because I think, that other product that we were speaking about previously, I think that's sort of one of the ways that they've gained such a tremendous amount of adoption of late, is by giving people, like, here, look, you can do this very easily. And it's a very small thing, right? I mean, the truth is, most of what people start with could be achieved very easily with other tools, but it's like, people love that. And if you sort of make it really clear to them, make it very concrete, I think you go a long way towards, as they grow with your product, because it has the depth to offer them the ability to scale and the ability to build really complex infrastructures, even by comparison, much more so than some other of its competitors. I think that's great. I'm glad to see that.
Yeah, I will say that, to your point, Chris, there are certain different tools that you can use for doing a number of the various things that SaltStack can do as well, but that's the problem right there, is that they are different tools, whereas Salt, you can use one tool to do all of it. That's been my experience. At a previous company I was working at, we actually had a similar issue where we were using one tool for orchestration and a different tool for configuration management, and trying to figure out how those two interacted was sometimes problematic. And so we actually ended up starting a move to using SaltStack so that we could just consolidate all of those things and just have everything in one place, so you didn't always have to jump back and forth between two different code bases and two completely different tools and programming languages and paradigms to try and understand what actually happens when you issue a certain command.
Well, and it's reassuring to hear what you're saying about it, because we're in the process of trying to develop exactly what you're describing, along the lines of giving people short videos and tutorials around, here's how you solve small problem X in Salt. And also emphasizing those around, here's how you solve a problem that you thought wasn't small, but here's how you do it in 2 minutes with Salt.
That's very smart, right? Because if they feel like it's big and they're shown, here's how to make it really easy, then that's going to be tremendously satisfying for people.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many people have come back and done things like set up completely automatic code deployment or canary environments with Salt that you don't even have to touch it. Somebody pushes code and a canary environment gets deployed for them, and they're done. And people are amazed at the fact that you can do that in less than 10 lines of code. I shouldn't quote it on a line basis. It depends on the tool you're using. But in minutes, you can set up these really complicated, fully autonomic systems. And so, yeah, we're definitely going to be coming out with a lot more instruction and documentation and videos around how to accomplish those things.
Wow, Thomas, if you wouldn't mind, especially if it's available on the web after the fact, it'd be really cool if you could link that 10-line canary environment deploy thing into the show notes, or hand it to us, or whatever. If it's assuming it's publicly available, because I think that would be a great opportunity for people to get a sense of how much Salt can do.
No, I'll definitely do that. We need to get that one out there. We've set this scenario up a lot. It's actually, the core idea came from Wikipedia. And so, because Wikipedia, as you probably know, uses Puppet for their configuration management, but they use Salt for their orchestration and deployment, and much of the configuration management that they use in newer deployments is pure Salt. and that they were incredibly early adopters, and they were the first ones to come back and say, hey, I can use Salt's peer system to pull this off. And after looking at how they developed it, we developed the event reactor system, which you've already mentioned, and developed that system in such a way to make the more complicated scenario that they built out something that was much easier, much more reproducible. And of course, you can do flipping anything with the event reactor system now.
Very cool. So following on to that question, what are some common problems that you've seen people struggle with when using SaltStack?
Getting back to their day job. Actually, in all honesty, that is a fairly common problem that we see, is that people will find Salt and they will go down the rabbit hole of just creating some of the most fantastic things. And then they kind of poke their head up and go, oh, everyone else is... The people that come and they just beg to work for us and say, I want to build these fantastic things all day long. So, for instance, one of my favorites is that at Hewlett-Packard, they developed a complete app container deployment system around Salt. They put it together in 3 weeks. It is a stable app container deployment system. They tossed a lightweight GUI on top of it. And so people inside of Hewlett-Packard, for internal development purposes, are able to just give a container definition, and it's instantly deployed, and it's all Salt under the hood, and Salt calling out to LXC, and to the extent where their users can use our Docker to LXC conversion components and just develop everything in Docker and plop it into Salt, and it deploys LXC containers. And that I'm actually kind of being a punk and turning your question of what are the problems with Salt into a Salt's fantastic answer. Usually some of the things that people have hiccups with is that they might, tread onto territory that's really, really new and run into some bugs that we hadn't hit yet. Or more of it is just kind of getting lost in the functionality. It's that people will pick up Salt and say, hey, I'm going to try out Salt for config management. And they don't realize that Salt is more of this total management system. And they start worrying too much about components that they don't need to worry about. So, I guess a lot of my answer there would be that if you're using Salt and you're worried going, oh, well, I don't understand how all these different systems work. Even in the config management system, if you're using Salt and you go, oh, I'm intimidated by prereq and all of these declarative components, which look scary, don't worry about it. You don't need to worry about those things. Just know that they're there.
It's like the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right?
Right. We generally compare it to like a SWAT team. Or a police department. You go in and your handgun will take care of the vast majority of situations, but that there's an assault rifle back there or tear gas or whatever you need to solve any problem you might run into. And that's kind of the benefit of Salt, that no matter what you run into, we have a solution for you.
That's great. And with regards to your getting back to their day job problem, well, if they really want to do this kind of thing all the time, there are so many companies hiring for infrastructure as code or DevOps or whatever you want to call it. I don't think they'd have to look very hard if they wanted to change disciplines and do this stuff for a living. I don't know how many are advertising explicitly for SaltStack, but a lot of them are so desperate that if you found someone who said, I know Salt and I can make it do wonders and wash your dishes and get your paper, I'm sure a lot of companies would be much more open to using it, given how desperately they're in need of the help.
I got to say, one of my favorite stories, or I should say, one of my favorite kind of stories, is to hear about how many people have been introduced to Salt who had minimal systems knowledge, minimal programming knowledge, and were able to dramatically improve their career over a very short period of time. One of my favorites was somebody in our community was working in a call center for a hotel chain, had never done system administration before, and heard about salt through just one of his friends. Said, "Hey, salt's cool. Look at it." And so we popped into IRC and studied our documentation and started helping people in IRC. 8 months later, the guy's making six figures at a major tech company in Seattle, deploying salt. And it's like, oh, well, you just got a 4x pay increase, buddy. but we have a ton of stories like that.
Right.
Yeah, and it makes it very rewarding to be able to feel like you are actually helping people on a more personal level instead of just saying, hey, your servers work better.
Yeah, I'll definitely say that one of the troubles that I've seen a couple times when I've been using Salt is running into that analysis paralysis of, okay, there's this particular problem I'm trying to solve, and now I see, okay, there are these 5 different ways I can use Salt to solve it, so which one is going to be optimal for my particular situation? But yeah, sometimes you just kind of have to pick one and run with it, and then if it doesn't work eventually, then you can go back and refactor it, which I will say Salt makes relatively easy because there is generally so little actual coding that you need to do to tie the different components together.
Well, and yeah, the analysis paralysis, I mean, we will have, I'll have some of our implementation and support people come up to me and say, oh, Tom, I don't know how to solve this problem over here, and I have no idea what's going on. I'll sit down and talk to them for 2 minutes and say, oh, don't you know about using an external pillar? And they go, oh, what's an external pillar? Or, and I'm like, oh, well, you're going to write 15 lines of Python code and hook into their existing CMDB and you're done. But yeah, we see it all the time. It's that there's so much there that either you don't know about, or if you do know about, it's kind of this feeling of, I've got to figure out what these 8 things do before I know which one to use. And it's really just a challenge of building a truly flexible system to be able to do that. And I'm hoping that us putting these videos out that are able to say XYZ, give people these concrete examples of this is a good way to use. I'm trying to think of something more esoteric inside of Salt, but I've already used up so many of them. Oh, but like this is a good way to use returners for auditing, or this is a good way, this is a good use case for building an engine inside of Salt and using that. And hopefully we can get those rolling soon. We just finished up this release, and I imagine you guys are familiar with how much of a pain it is to finish up major releases.
Oh, yes.
Oh, and we just finished a conference. Conferences are murder. I mean, conferences are so fantastic, so much fun, but putting on a conference is just the most painful thing in the world.
Well, I'm sure it's not unlike doing a major release, right? From the outside, people are like, well, come on already. Like, where is it? Shouldn't you have been done 2 weeks ago? But there you are, laboring in the trenches because it becomes such a fractal problem of achieving that last, 2 feet to cross the finish line. It's like, we just have these really critical problems we have to solve, and then we can do it. And I think it seems like putting on a conference is very similar. From the outside, it seems like, so what's the big deal? You rent a venue, you get some speakers, it's easy. But there's this incredibly fractal amount of work behind the scenes to arrange all the logistics to make it happen.
Oh, tell me about it. I mean, for our first conference, I had to write, what was it? I had to write about 150 pages of training manual content in like a week and a half before that conference happened. And it's just insane doing that stuff. So, yeah.
So, what are some of the most surprising or interesting things that you've seen people do with Salt Stack? Things that you just never would have even imagined possible with when you first wrote it?
There's a lot. We get used a great deal for probably the first one that surprised me when I found out about Salt being used to manage medical devices. that they were using salt on embedded devices that were being put throughout a hospital. I don't even remember what they're monitoring, but it was monitoring something relative to the patients, and then using salt as this data aggregator. And that was back in 2012 when salt was just a year old. And we look at it now, and our current play and a lot of what we're working on for security mitigation has kind of surprised me. I can't tell you how proud I am of all the tweets that come out after Heartbleed and Shell Shock that were people saying, hey, I mitigated shell shock in 4 minutes with SaltStack over 10,000 servers.
Wow.
I love those. And I come back and I say, 4 minutes? What took it so long? And they say, oh, don't worry, Salt had actually done its work in a minute and a half, but the other time was testing.
Yeah, I definitely saw a number of those tweets come out after those events as well. It's definitely gratifying to see that.
Yeah, it's very reassuring. And but probably one that I'm really proud of most recently was that a nonprofit set up a bunch of weather monitoring stations using Raspberry Pis in South Africa. And these stations are used to give early alerts to locals who otherwise don't have access to this kind of information or don't have access to be scanning for this information. And so SALT is used to set up all of these weather stations, and then the SALT event bus is used to channel information back to a central hub about what's going on. And that whole Internet of Things component is just something I'm really excited about. We've got companies that are starting to use SALT for home automation purposes inside of just arbitrary home automation devices. And they love it. They come back and they say, this is great because I've got a home automation device and everything is going through this standard interface that SALT just gives me. And so, yeah, that stuff is a lot more esoteric than, we manage a big data center, which we do lots of that.
So when you talk about the Internet of Things and these weather stations and things like that, just for the purposes of those of us who are less SALT savvy, would that be something like a minion running on that Raspberry Pi?
Yeah. So people will put a minion on the Raspberry Pi, and then just have a master running back, either at an office somewhere or in a some central location. And all of those minions are just reporting back into that master. And it's actually interesting too, the different ways that I've seen people do it, because a classical SALT deployment is that you've got the ZeroMQ maintaining this TCP connection back to the master. But we recently introduced RATE, which is a UDP protocol, and we've got the ability to, and we recently, not too recently, it's maybe a year and a half old, the scheduler in SALT. The recent thing about SALT's scheduler is that we just added tons of additions onto its capabilities so that your scheduling can be incredibly granular now. But a lot of people will just fire up that minion and say, I don't care about the constant connection, or the TCP connection isn't going to do the right kind of traversal, but I can route it with SALT's UDP protocol, or I can just set the scheduler to have that minion act as this detached agent that is either pinging a master on a regular basis, or we just take the master out of the equation altogether, and all of those minions are just using SALT's returner interface. And the returner interface is SALT's plug-in interface that allows you to connect to virtually any database. And so they just use SALT's returner interface to run commands on a schedule and just have that go to some arbitrary database somewhere. And it's that flexibility, that fundamental decoupling, that is really what allows SALT to work in such disparate environments.
That's very cool, and I really do think that that is a distinguishing feature of Salt versus almost any of the other configuration. Well, I can't call it a configuration management system, as you pointed out. That's a misnomer. Well, I guess that's a really distinguishing feature compared to other configuration management systems, of which Salt is not one, on the market. It really sort of, like you say, lends it to be used in areas or environments where traditional CM probably can't really offer that much, or bringing them to bear rather, might be a little bit obtuse or hard to get around. Very cool.
Yeah, one thing that I've seen a few different implementations of that I thought was very interesting was actually using Salt as the monitoring and alerting platform for an infrastructure where they had a scheduler set up to have the minions send back the CPU statistics, memory statistics back to a particular returner backend, whether it be a graphite database or a relational database, or I think I've even seen some in Elasticsearch, and then also using that same capabilities to actually generate alerts from that data. Definitely pretty cool.
Yeah, and that's one of the big pushes that we're working on right now, because we want to make sure that we're able to really satisfy all those needs and make it much more streamlined to use Salt for your full stack of monitoring. And really, why not? I mean, we've already got this execution library of modules that can already do all the monitoring for you.
Great.
Yeah,
That is great.
Yeah, one of the things that people say about Salt's config management is they say Salt is a config management system in the same way that Google is a search engine.
Or perhaps Emacs is an editor, right? So, just to sort of, I guess as an homage to one of my favorite technical podcasts that partially inspired me to want to do this one, we have what we call the picks that we like to do, and we'd like you to pick, a few things. They can be technical or non-technical, just things that you like. It can be software technology, it can be beer, a board game, something, a smartphone app, whatever it is, just something you think that's cool and you'd like to tell people about.
Oh, something that I think is cool that I would like to tell people about. I am a big fan of flow-based programming. I think that the flow-based programming paradigm offers a completely different approach to how you think about computing, and especially distributed systems. And we've been playing around with it a lot, trying to figure out a good way to implement flow-based programming inside of Salt in such a way that optimizes things. So, I mean, that's definitely something that I would encourage people to look into. I'm trying to think of something that's non-technical, but I'm terrible because my entire life has been so incredibly obsessed with with Salt recently that I don't get out much.
That's quite all right.
I can definitely relate to that, but go for the technical.
Yeah.
So, can you give us an example of a flow-based programming system?
Yeah. So Salt. One thing that we dug up to support Salt is something called IOflow. So I used to work in the U.S. intelligence community as a contractor, and so I can neither confirm nor deny many things. But I became aware of this flow programming platform that they were using to manage robotics called IOflow. And I knew the developer and knew the right contacts. And, we call it IOflow. Internally, it was something else. And I was able to coax it out into the open once it was renamed and scrubbed,
Right.
And the IOflow project is an incredibly powerful flow programming system. It's pure Python, and I'm not going to say that it's easy to learn how it works. It's kind of complicated because, it was written in the dark for autonomous vehicles and submarines. But when it comes to building autonomous systems, it's incredibly useful. I mean, it takes a while to get your head around, and all the documentation is obtuse and very academic, but it's just this incredibly cool system. And the whole idea behind flow programming is that you've got this data bus, and so all of the data for your application is on this data bus. You don't make objects with isolated data. And then you've got these black boxes. IOflow calls them behaviors. And then those behaviors access the data bus. And so the behaviors are restricted to only be able to get certain data off of the data bus. And so then they can read and write certain data off of the data bus. And then all of these behaviors are just on this schedule, checking the bus to say, did something change? Oh, that thing changed, so this behavior should run. And it's just a fascinating programming paradigm. And again, I think a very, very, very powerful one. And IOflow is a fantastic example of how it works. I'd really like to extend IOflow or build a system like IOflow that better abstracted the concepts of flow-based programming. But I mean, one thing at a time.
Absolutely. Is IOflow open source? Googling it, I see a Microsoft Research Publications paper on it.
Oh, you're probably spelling it wrong. It's IOFLO. There's no W.
Ah.
And it's Apache licensed.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. That helps a lot. There we go. I found it. It's on GitHub. Super cool. Thank you. We'll put that in the show notes. That sounds really neat.
Yeah, definitely cool stuff.
That's great. Don't feel any pressure. You gave us a really good one there. Do you have any other picks you'd like to cite?
Oh, God. No, I don't know. Imagine Dragons are awesome, but everybody already knows that.
Hey, man, that works. It's music is one of those amazing things that there's literally, there's something for everyone. So I like Imagine Dragons too, and who knows, this podcast could reach someone in outer Slobobia who's never heard of the Imagine Dragons, and now they'll be prompted to go on Spotify and give them a listen. So
well, you just reached one because I've never heard of them.
Well, so there you go. There you go.
Oh, really? Oh, man, they wail. You got to check those guys out.
Yeah, well, as soon as we're off this call, I'll go check it out.
Very cool. So I guess I'll move on to my picks. And the first pick that I will pick is a beer, because I like good craft beer. And when I was in California, one of the things I love about craft beer is that as I get to travel, I really enjoy trying the craft beers that are only available in that region, because some of it doesn't travel particularly well. And I had the opportunity to try a pint of Stone Imperial Russian Stout. And it was really delicious. I really love Stone Brewery. I find that their beers really sort of like hit the nail on the head with craft beer. Sometimes, with things like a stout or there are a few other varieties like this, there's so much complexity there that it's very easy for a brewery that's not particularly expert to have their beer come out kind of one note. And this one is balanced perfectly. It's delicious, malty goodness. It's great stuff. If you like dark beer, or even if you think you don't like beer at all, but have only been fed things like Budweiser, not to say there's anything wrong with Budweiser, or very light hoppy beers, you might give it a shot. The second pick that I have is actually a blog post by Arun Ravindran. I'm sure I mangled his name horribly, being an insular American who can't pronounce foreign words, but it's called Python One-Liner Games. I'll put the link in the show notes. And what I find to be really cool about this post, these are not games like, Metal Gear Solid or anything like that. These are like computer games like those of us who are old and crusty used to play in the days when we used to type them in BASIC, things like that. Things like character-generated mazes and snake games and like really just simplistic things. But they're one-liners, and thus I think they're very cool. I'm a big fan of whimsy in programming, and I think that we need to get it any way we can. So I really enjoyed that post. And the third thing that I want to pick is the Boston Python meetup. I went for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and I really, really enjoyed it. It was the quality of the content being presented was top notch, and I met some really cool people. And in general, I mean, if you're not involved in meetups near you, and chances are there is one near you, unless you also live in outer Slobovia, it's definitely worth taking the time to drop by and say hello. You chances are you won't regret it. That's it for me.
So for my first pick, I'm going to pick a somewhat self-serving one that's rather topical. So I actually recently wrote a couple of blog posts about my experience in using SaltStack to move a friend and client from Heroku onto AWS. So I'll put links to those two posts in the show notes. For my next pick, I'd like to choose there's a tool called CopyQ that is a clipboard manager that I use on the KDE desktop on Linux. I believe it's cross-platform to at least OS X and I believe Windows. But it is an amazing clipboard manager. It lets you maintain clipboard history. You can edit it. You can categorize it into separate tabs. So, for instance, I use Emacs as my main editor. And whenever you highlight a line in Emacs or, copy it into an Emacs buffer, it also shows up in your clipboard, so it was just spamming my main clipboard and just pushing everything relevant back off of the list. So I was able to set up a filter so that anything coming from my Emacs program went into its own tab, so it was still accessible and searchable, but it wasn't polluting my main clipboard history. So it's a phenomenal system, definitely worth checking out. And I'll also choose the Pelican static site generator. That's actually what I use to write and run my blog. It's a Python-based static site generator, has a really good plugin system, has a really good repository of themes that make it really easy to get up and running with a decent-looking website. Has a lot of different capabilities, so you can use it for regular, generating regular websites. It's primarily used for blogging, but phenomenal, very popular project, definitely worth checking out. And the last one I'll pick today is a website called Noisely, Noisli, and it is a white noise generator. So you go there, and there are a number of different sounds that you can choose, and you can adjust the volume. So, for instance, you could say, I want to have a little bit of wind, a little bit of crackling fire, and maybe a thunderstorm in the background. And you can just mix and match from all those different sounds to make a really pleasant ambient sound for you to listen to when you're really trying to focus. I found sometimes when I'm listening to music while I program, it can be great, it can be motivating, but sometimes it can just be a little bit too distracting, and I found Noisely to be perfect for those situations.
Very cool.
That is all I have for picks.
That's awesome. The Noisely thing sounds really neat. I mean, there's certainly I have a couple of old CDs that I've been using for like 20 years. Called environments, and there's a couple in particular like the ocean waves and rain, and I have yet to find any kind of digital thing that comes as close to filling that niche for me as these recordings. I'll have to give Noisely a try and see if it passes muster.
So that does it for this show. Thomas, is there anything that you'd like to plug or any appearances that you're going to be having anytime soon that you'd like to let our listeners know about?
Well, I mean, I would like to. You invited me to plug something, so I will. And you were talking about picks. Another project that I put together is something called libnackle. Which is Python bindings to the libsodium library, and they've been abstracted in such a way to make cryptography incredibly safe and easy and incredibly easy to use. So if you ever need super strong cryptography, take a look at libnackle. libnacl. But yeah, we've got. We're gonna be at PyCon. We're over at the Microsoft Build Conference. Yeah, salt's all over the place. So yeah, keep an eye open on what we're doing.
Okay. And for anybody who'd like to follow you and the Salt Project, where can they find you?
Well, I am THatch45 on GitHub. I am THatch45 on Twitter. I don't tweet very much. I keep trying to tweet more, but I'm a bad tweeter. But yeah, definitely follow the Salt Project, which is at GitHub, saltstack/salt. And we've got a bunch of other really cool projects in there. And yeah, join the community. We love merging code. And we work really hard to have a nurturing and a very positive community that helps people learn how to improve, which has worked out really well for us. So yeah, definitely look us up.
That's great. I just have to ask, sir, what's the 45 in THatch 45?
So there's a bit of a story. 45 is my lucky number because when I was 10, I was playing Legend of Zelda on the 8-bit Nintendo, and I closed my eyes and named my Zelda character, and Link ended up being named 45.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it was the best game of Zelda that I'd ever played. I got through like the 5th labyrinth without dying, and so I just always used 45.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm very glad I asked.
Well, thank you very much for listening. Thomas, thank you for joining us, and we are looking forward to bringing you another great episode as soon as possible.